Hello and good morning, everyone, and welcome to the weekly early morning roundtable. As a reminder, we do this every Friday at 10 a.m. Central Time. Each early morning analyst gets a chance to talk about what the most important thing they think is each week. And we're going to go ahead and lead off with Robert talking about the incoming Trump administration's new offensive cyber strategy. Robert, this is something that all administrations for the past 20 plus years have really struggled with, and that is deterring Chinese cyber exploitation and hacking, especially into very sensitive critical infrastructure here in the United States. As a reminder, also, please put your questions and comments into the chat and we will get to them. With that, Robert, go ahead and take us through your outlook here on what the Trump administration is going to change about an obviously failed strategy so far.
So I think the incoming Trump administration is likely to adopt a more offensive cyber strategy and a more offensive posture, especially in light of the recent Department of Treasury hacks that have come to light. And that is on top of the Volt Typhoon hacks that officials have been saying for more than 2 years now. They're pre-positioning resources on U.S. networks in anticipation of some kind of crisis or conflict with China. Why I think that's why this is changing now. We're starting to see a lot more of these hacks are a lot deeper and broader than have been reported previously, and there are a lot more cybersecurity experts pushing for some kind of offensive strategy. And a lot of critics of the cyber strategy over the last 48 years have said that the response of voluntary security standards being pushed down and basically responding with diplomatic letters is just not working. And this is part of, I think there's a couple things going on here. One, this is, China-linked hackers pre-positioning on U.S. networks for critical infrastructure. I think with the intent in a crisis to, cause disruptions, but there's also an intelligence gathering aspect, especially with this Department of Treasury hack, where the systems that they intruded on are, I think they're trying to gather information on how the United States could weather the storm, the capacity of the United States to win a trade war between the United States and China. And I think the implication here is if there is a more offensive cyber strategy implemented by the Trump administration, we could see China and other foreign adversaries taking advantage of the situation to ramp up cyber intrusions and attacks. And we could see if we do get to this basically culmination of a trade war and possible fight over Taiwan, we could see more disruptions of utilities at the local level from not just from China-linked hackers, but Iranian-linked hackers who've hit water utilities. And we could also see more disruptions of telecoms and more hacks, especially targeting U.S. officials.
So, hey, Robert, looking at NSA, Cybercom, they're obviously far better at, sorry, my kids in the background. They're obviously far better at cyber offense than they are at cyber defense. And looking at this, is there any level of cyber offense that will actually deter China, seeing as how they have much more to lose than we do in terms of cyber disruption to cyber information communications and critical infrastructure?
So the impression that I get is that we haven't actually we haven't tested that to figure out if we haven't really been on the offensive to see if there is something that a point where we can reach where China will be deterred. When I worked on this project for the Office of Secretary of Defense, they were looking for a explicitly deterrent strategy. And Doctors Fisher Keller and Harknett, who were working with U.S. Army Cyber Command at the time, they had this idea that how it exists now is basically an iterated game where the U.S. and China, will respond with offensive cyber attacks, what the U.S. Army Cyber Command calls persistent engagement, to kind of figure out where this line is, where deterrence occurs. But as far as I understand, paying attention to like Joshua Steinman, the former National Security Council staffer who has a major interest in cybersecurity strategy, that this offensive iterative game was never really engaged in by the U.S. And we've mostly been focused on calling out, I think as the State Department calls it, calling out these cyber attacks. Oh, you're muted, Mike.
It seems like someone over at NSA would have the cyber nuclear option as a deterrent, but I guess we'll see. All right, thanks for that, Robert. We are going to move on to Mark. Good morning. We've heard from a number of countries on their stance on these deportations. Some of these countries do not want to take their own citizens back, and it really makes you wonder which of their citizens are over here. So, Mark, we'll start in Mexico and head south. What are these Latin American countries saying in response to Trump's deportations plan?
Yeah, hey Mike. So if you look at our map that we have up on the slide, I kind of collected these together. Every Latin American country is going to have a different response to these deportation policies, making it incredibly complex to navigate. If we start with Mexico, we see that Mexico is cooperative, but they will be bargaining. We've seen a lot of talk, rhetoric between the president of Mexico and then the incoming President Donald Trump. Some of the bargaining measures that this is going to affect trade, tariffs. There's also going to be other diplomatic fights dealing with the relationship that Mexico has with China. All of these things are going to be kind of bundled together in the negotiations moving forward on how Mexico will deal with this and how the United States will prosecute it. Now, one of the things that we did report on earlier, maybe I think it was last week, we talked about how Mexico has the largest consular network here in the United States out of any consular network in the world. Mexico wields a lot of influence, lobbying Congress as well. And so the Mexican government just announced that they have an initiative in place in which this consular network will provide Mexican undocumented migrants with legal resources and assistance if they face deportation. So all of these measures are going to kind of come together. Mexico's a major player in this. The United States also has quite a bit of leverage with Mexico. So this is going to be a situation where there will be some cooperation, but there will be a lot of bargaining between the two countries. Now, moving down further south, we'll find some of these Central American countries. The most notable of these, obviously, there's going to be like El Salvador, a lot more cooperation there. But then there will also be countries like Honduras, which have joined Venezuela in being fully resistant to some of President-elect Trump's plans for deportation. So every one of these countries, we did report on Panama as well. There might be some cooperation with bargaining there, but every one of these countries will have a different response to Donald Trump's priorities. And what this means is the president, this is going to be a knockout, drag out fight for years. And the president will have to prioritize these things. They will have to prioritize these measures throughout his presidency, and there will have to be a fusion of national security agencies with his diplomatic arm, with some of with like the Department of Commerce and with trade. All of these things will have to come together in attempting to resolve this problem. If the president is unable to do this, we aren't going to see significant changes to this problem. We'll probably have a revisiting of it in the next 5 to 10 years where we encounter wave after wave again.
Yeah, Mark, I noted that Honduras is one of those countries that is rejecting their own citizens coming back. And I believe Honduras has even threatened to maybe close down some military base in Honduras. What do you make of that?
Yeah, that's honestly, that's kind of the elephant in the room in this is one of the biggest concerns that the United States has right now, should have, and I think the president-elect has, is that the United States has to maintain hegemony over the Western Hemisphere. That means the United States has to be the major player and call the shots here in the Western Hemisphere. This has been a foreign policy priority since James Monroe. Now, the biggest problem that we have, though, is that over dereliction of our elite and our foreign policy establishment in Washington, we have seen significant inroads from China made all across Latin America. We've reported on many of these Chinese ports. We talked about Panama. We talked about some of its relationships with countries like Mexico into Central America. China is playing a hard game in Latin America, and where this intersects with our plans for deportation is it greatly diminishes our leverage over these countries, because now we have a major competitor in the region who is able to kind of thwart some of our policy priorities by trying to alleviate the pressure that we'll be putting on these countries. And so things like military bases, ports, access to the Panama Canal, trade with these countries, China, it has to be understood as a major player in affecting how we address things like deportation. So honestly, this is like the perfect storm for the worst possible time, with an ascendant China, very present in Latin America. This is like really the worst possible time to have an immigration crisis.
I would also note on the topic of China that there was an op-ed in a Mexican newspaper earlier this week that effectively said Mexico has the option to pivot away from the United States and pivot towards China if Trump and Sheinbaum really want to play hardball. I thought that was very interesting. I don't think it's the most likely, but just the mere threat of that is, I think, significant. All right, Mark, thanks for that. We will move on now to Max. Good morning. Let's take a look at the latest in Syria. What's going on?
Good morning, Mike and viewers. Well, a lot of diplomatic activity going on in the Middle East right now, mostly around Syria. Today, the German and French foreign ministers are meeting with the acting head, Jalani, of the HTS-backed interim government in Syria. But I think the most significant activity occurred yesterday, and that's when Syria's new foreign and defense ministers put on suits and headed on over to Riyadh for a personal meeting with the Saudi defense minister and their foreign minister. Also, the new Syrian intelligence chief tagged along, but we're not really certain who he met with over there behind closed doors, other than the defense and the Saudi defense and foreign minister. And so what's all this? Why is this significant? Well, this is the first trip that the Syrian government officials have made outside of Syria to meet with regional power players. And it's significant that the first trip was to Riyadh to meet with Saudi Arabia. This kind of signals that they view Saudi Arabia as one of the key, or if not the key player in the region, and they want to normalize relations with them. The impact of this, well, obviously normalizing diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia and also European nations and other, regional players is going to help reestablish the Syrian economy and kind of rebuild the defense and security infrastructure that was destroyed by Israel as a preemptive action when the Assad government fell. Outlook on this, I'd say we're going to start seeing a lot more efforts by the Syrian government to establish broad support in the Middle East with its neighbors. And also, where they can, they're going to try and pick up some major world powers. Implications, Saudi Arabia is the key to getting support from the other Gulf Cooperation Council states. So this was a smart move on their part to hit Saudi Arabia first. But also remember, Saudi Arabia has gotten very cozy with China. So we could see this Syrian-backed government not only make inroads with a current tenant, Russia, who still has bases on the Mediterranean in Syria, but also with Russia's partner and ally, China, via Saudi introduction to China, and that could end up being a big source of funding for rebuilding Syrian infrastructure.
Mm-hmm. One other thing I would note here, Max, is going back to Obama. Obama bet on Iran as his racehorse in the Middle East, as did Biden. Trump has had much cozier relations with the Saudis. With this kind of destruction of the far west end of the Iranian crescent in Syria here, do you think this is going to turn the tide of power in the Middle East far more favorably to Saudi Arabia? I mean, can we look at some level of capitulation by Iran? I mean, there's this potential Israeli-Iranian war kind of sitting in the background potentially here. What do you make of, say, the next 4 years in terms of the balance of power in the Middle East? What's going to happen to Iran, you think?
A lot, Mike, depends on what the Trump administration does and how quickly they get into the fight in the Middle East in terms of rebuilding alliances that the Biden administration basically threw in the trash. Us trying to realign the U.S., meaning us trying to realign our interests in the Middle East with Iran was pretty much a foreign policy disaster. Iran is significantly weakened. I don't see them being the major player in the Middle East. They don't wield as much power now because they've lost a lot of reach with their proxies. And so I see a reemergence of Saudi Arabia as the key power player in the Middle East. And the problem is that we kind of pulled back during the Biden administration from Saudi Arabia in our attempt to realign with Iran, and that's allowed China, to get in the back door with Saudi Arabia, and extended a BRICS invitation to Saudi Arabia and some of the other states in the region. And so we've got a lot of ground to make up. So yeah, short answer, Saudi Arabia, I think, is going to emerge as the key power player. I think we're going to see lines on the map redrawn in Syria. And I think we're going to see some, world power competition for attention, not just with Syria, but with this kind of new Middle East geopolitical reality.
Mm-hmm. All right, lots of changes. Thanks for that, Max. And we're going to move on to a domestic issue here. One of the things that we have noticed over the past several months, well, actually, this is going back to the initial Trump administration, the first one, is the concept of de-arresting. I talked about it last week, and there's been also a complementary focus on building these rapid response networks. As a matter of fact, there's a deportation support hotline run by one of these left-wing groups. And what they're telling people is, call this hotline if you need help, if you're at risk of being deported. And they're trying to build these rapid response networks, predominantly in these major cities. There's a number of organizations. Mi Gente, which is a kind of, it means my race. It's kind of a Hispanic, ethnic or racial supremacist organization. There's OCAD, which is Organized Communities Against Deportations. There's also Sanctuary DMV, which is active in DC, Maryland, and Virginia. And there's some assorted organizations across the country. But this deportation hotline, they want folks to call it. And when people do call that hotline, they want to be able to mobilize these rapid response networks, which are organized primarily online and through these local community organizing efforts. Social media all calls, so they'll post something on Instagram or Twitter or Blue Sky or Mastodon or wherever, and it's just a big broadcast to try to get as many people to mobilize as possible. They'll share an address, an apartment complex, a neighborhood in one of these cities, and they'll probably show videos and pictures of immigration and customs enforcement officers or law enforcement officers trying to arrest, at least beginning with, these criminal aliens. And so they want to do this to create, these left-wing organizations want to do this because ultimately they want to roll back this deportation policy and creating a big mess, creating lots of civil unrest, mass mobilization protests, direct action, whether that's civil disobedience or de-arresting or direct obstruction in these mass deportations and arrests. They wanted to create public backlash against that. And one way they could do that, and one way they tried to do that back during the first Trump administration, is by creating alleged or the perception of police violence and police brutality. And so that actually plays very greatly in their favor. The implication, obviously, is that this poses a risk to the Trump administration. A majority of Americans right now, at least according to recent polling, actually support mass deportation. And we're maybe a handful of videos away from abuelitas being, little grandmothers being put in flex cuffs and put into an ICE van, or children or these families being rounded up. Maybe a few of those videos away from public sentiment turning against mass deportation. And if you're one of these left-wing groups, that's exactly what you want to cause. You want to cause chaos, and you just want to have it be a giant mess to really spur that national debate. My bottom line on this is these groups exist across the United States. They're building these rapid response networks, which include phone trees, email, social media campaigns, which means you can join those phone trees, you can get on those email lists, and you can follow those social media accounts. And you should put these groups in your area study for situational awareness, because eventually this is going to come around to your neighborhood or your city or your part of the country or the state. And situational awareness is always good. And with that, we do have some questions which we'll get to here shortly. And with that, we're going to move on to Jared. and Robert to talk about the trade war.
Yes, good morning. So, what's going on over the past couple of weeks? We've seen that the U.S. and allies are trying to weaken China's sphere of influence in the Pacific. They're moving corporations out of China en masse, announcing new weapon systems and transferring the control of weapon systems that are capable of striking the Chinese homeland, and expanding already pretty expansive defense agreements. Meanwhile, China is levying more and more sanctions against defense contractors in the West, infiltrating the U.S. Treasury Department and running blockade drills against U.S. allies that previously had not. As far as why now, each side, I think, is preparing for a trade war expected from President-elect Trump's proposed 100% tariffs and a potential hot war over disruption in the Asia Pacific. I think supply chains are likely to be in flux over the next several months as they are nearshored or friendshored in preparation for this trade war. Both sides are going to continue rapidly preparing for a trade war and potentially an early hot war by targeting weak points in each other's spheres of influence. I think the big implication here is that China is likely to be increasingly belligerent as foreign capital leaves, and they may even feel pressured to move on Taiwan before they are militarily ready ahead of the 2027 timeline.
Yeah, and what I've been seeing on both domestic and foreign fronts is that a lot of these corporations are considering moving their supply chains. I think it was PricewaterhouseCoopers had a roundtable this week or last week where they're telling basically their clients to prepare for these tariffs, and they're saying $800 billion in tariffs per year they're expecting out of the Trump administration, and they're telling their clients this is these tariffs are going to be larger than your profit margin, your related profit margin. So you should start looking at changing supply chains from China into either third countries or the United States. I know there have been, even in South Korea and China, corporations considering the impact of moving their production outside of China to third-party countries, Thailand, Vietnam, or back to the United States, and even searching for alternative markets for some of their products that are manufactured in China. And this is, I think this pressure on China to do this is one of those factors that I think it was earlier this week we talked about some experts who said that there are incentives for China not to engage in a trade war because they're worried about hurting their domestic economy. And I think that is one of those motivating factors where if these companies start reshoring out their production away from China, that might remove that incentive not to engage in this trade war.
One thing, too, that I've seen investment banks like Goldman Sachs, for instance, was talking about this a week or two ago. Trump favors a weaker dollar because he wants to boost U.S. exports. So a weaker dollar would make U.S. products cheaper for foreign countries, and a stronger dollar would make it more expensive. And this Goldman Sachs, one of their asset managers, was talking about the Chinese response. And he basically said, China's going to try to depreciate their currency to stay competitive and make their products cheaper than American products. And there's not really a whole lot of stuff you can do about it. I do see some comments in the chat here about China being in a precarious situation or overextending themselves. I'm going to be very interested to see how the Treasury Secretary and the Fed both look at how China's depreciating their currency in response. Because that's just going to escalate tariffs, escalate the trade war, and we'll have to see what Trump does. But that's going to be a developing issue that will happen. All right, and with that, everyone, we will go ahead and get to your questions and comments, starting with. Let's jump on this New Orleans and Las Vegas thing. I think, Robert, you were following that. There's some talk about the Las Vegas and New Orleans terrorists both being at Fort Bragg, and people were talking about a nexus, and maybe they had met each other there, and maybe these two things could be related. I'm somewhat doubtful about that. But have you, and I think the FBI has even come out and, for what it's worth, come out to say that they don't believe these two events are connected, even though there are some very odd similarities. But what's the latest on this, Robert?
Yeah, what I've seen, the latest is that the FBI is saying they have not found any kind of connection between the two. And in the case of the Las Vegas one, I think his current wife talked to the media, and apparently there's some kind of domestic dispute that ahead of him disappearing for a couple days and then reappearing in front of the Trump International Hotel Las Vegas. In the New Orleans case, some stuff has come out about his background. He's twice divorced, which apparently financially ruined him. But I think that while both of these seem to have kind of that shared nexus of, domestic troubles, I think in the case of the New Orleans one, that was more of a motivating factor for him to turn to self-radicalization. There was also a report that he had traveled to Egypt for 10 days this past year. So that there is that, without any further information, that does have an opportunity for him to get some kind of political education and technical education on ahead of this attack, because Egypt is a major nexus for Islamic radical ideology.
Mm-hmm. And we do have a question. I want to bring Max on next, a question about Egypt. There's a question here about these ongoing Palestine action protests in Manhattan, promoting the global intifada. I don't see these as being directly connected. Obviously, they're on the Islamist side of this, but I don't see a direct link between Palestine action or the Students for Palestine Justice and these other social justice and kind of pro Palestinian organizations as being connected whatsoever to New Orleans. Hey, Jared, can we bring Max on for this next question here? It is, what is our relationship with Egypt? So there's been a lot of turnover in terms of who runs Egypt now, but in terms of U.S.-Egypt relations, what's your take on that, Max?
I mean, we have the same relationship we had with Egypt that we had, a couple of years ago. I mean, nothing has significantly changed. I mean, there was a big change during the Obama era, during, the uprising or whatever they were calling it at the time. I forget. It was a big nothing burger, but there was some turnover there. I think we still have a solid relationship with Egypt. I see this Hamas and Palestinian terrorism thing that's going on. This is just a tool. This is a tool for the left. They've cranked this up. It always existed below the surface, and it didn't really get much attention. But the left is just cranking this tool up because they're going to use this to kind of drive a wedge between Americans, undermine the Trump administration, cause problems with civil unrest. That's all we're seeing here. I don't think there's any backing from Egypt for this Hamas thing in the Palestinian cause. As a matter of fact, the Egyptians have hosted the Palestinians on several occasions, and they've booted them out of their country. The Palestinians have been nothing but problems for neighboring countries like Jordan and Egypt. And that's why there's a big, gigantic wall with an armored division at the border between Gaza and Egypt. It's not to keep the Israelis out, it's to keep the Palestinians out. So I don't see Egypt getting their hands into what's happening domestically here with this Hamas pro-Palestinian problem the U.S. is starting to encounter. But I do see the Muslim Brotherhood in it. It's just that I don't think the Muslim Brotherhood is Egypt. It's a problem that the Egyptians are dealing with too. I think it's kind of transnational at this point, but it's kind of below the surface. It supports some of these groups with funding, but that funding doesn't necessarily come from Egypt. It comes from other rich Arab donors around the world, and even some corporations.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks for that, Max. We do have some other questions. We'll bring you back on here shortly. I want Robert for this one, talking about the Blue State Coalition here, Robert. So this is something you've been tracking for a while. Back in 2017, I believe there were 6 states with Dem trifectas. Now, this month, there will be 15 states with Democratic trifectas. So that's a Democratic governor, Democratic state house, and Democratic state senate. That's a lot more political and diplomatic power that these blue state coalitions have. I guess this question is open-ended, but can we get an update here on this blue state coalition? What are the latest things you've you're seeing that they're planning to do against the Trump administration?
Well, the last I saw is that some of these states, especially California, they're putting in millions of dollars preparing for these lawsuits. It's not just immigration; they also want to oppose, Trump changing a lot of energy policy. One of the big ones is they're preparing lawsuits for I think like Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act policies that the EPA has implemented that Trump wants to put the kibosh on, like the Clean Power Plan 2.0, these vehicle emission rules, the EV incentives, basically these emission laws that they're pushing, like California is using to push the electrification of like commercial truck fleets, and they're preparing lawsuits to oppose those. And as far as I know, they're still going forward. It's just they're kind of waiting on the Trump's inauguration and these appointees to actually start changing these rules.
Mm-hmm. All right, next question for you is just tracking the stuff you've been talking about, the bird flu off and on for a while. There's a question here about, are there any serious threats from diseases such as whooping cough or anything else that you've heard? I saw where the Texas governor, Greg Abbott, came out and said he's not going to do mandatory masking, but there have been apparently some governors and municipal officials talking about requiring masks again. Now, you're not a doctor. You did say at a Holiday Inn last night. What are you seeing on this?
Well, as far as I understand the immigration crisis is a big nexus for a lot of diseases coming in the United States, especially ones that are not normally widespread, and that there is a risk of that. And I'm also seeing, there's been some developments on the bird flu side where they're seeing more human cases, including potentially one that could mutate to become more infectious. But I think a lot of these other diseases, other than this H5N1, a lot of that has to do with just how much traffic has moved across the U.S. border. So a lot of these diseases that come from the third world are able to come into the United States and spread a lot more than they would have 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm. And haven't we seen some food recalls also over these the bird flu?
Yeah, there's been there were some different contamination. Salmonella, I think, was the big boar's head recall where they recalled like millions of pounds, like 1 million pounds of meat, and part of that also possibly due to the immigration crisis. We're seeing, I think Boar's Head actually partnered with one of the big NGOs that were trying to get jobs for asylum seekers to get them into these meat processing facilities, and suddenly we have large outbreaks that are probably due to bad health, like lowering health standards and cross contamination. And it's also, I think we reported on it in 2022 or 2023, there was a big recall for like foreign imported food from Latin America that was contaminated as well with different types of bacteria. So that's another vector where we're seeing, possibly seeing diseases come to the United States in a larger quantity.
Mm-hmm. All right, thanks, Robert. Let's here. I guess here's the rest of the question. What if Trump initially focuses his deportation on red states, or do you think? What do you think the Trump response will be for these blue states that are not going to cooperate with immigration enforcement? They could block physically or try to legally block the enforcement of federal immigration laws in these states. We've heard a lot of questions about whether Trump is going to try to cut funding. Previous administrations have done that, like here in Texas back during the TSA heyday. There's the anti-groping bill here in Texas that passed, and the federal government said, that's fine. You can try to kick out the TSA from the state of Texas, but it's federal airspace. And if passengers aren't going through a TSA, then, we'll restrict flights over federal airspace in Texas. And so that didn't last very long. What do you expect from the Trump administration here?
Well, on this question of standing in blue states, I think it's basically blue states wouldn't have standing to openly oppose immigration enforcement. I think what they're going to go after is if Trump tries to reverse DACA. That's a big one that he tried during his first administration. It was actually blocked by the courts in a very technical way, saying that he just didn't do it correctly, not necessarily that he didn't have the authority to. And I think that's what they're going to be looking for, these technicalities with how these immigration rules are implemented to try to get the courts to stop them from doing it. So I don't think it's necessarily a standing issue for blue states. One of the things that a lot of them are doing at the municipal level is they're basically saying they're going to block cooperation in the use of like state and local resources. But I think there's also a lot of these blue state mayors and even governors who are trying to kind of run interference by saying, well, we'll cooperate with removing violent criminals who happen to be illegal immigrants is like a way to kind of run interference on further immigration enforcement.
Mm-hmm. All right. Hey, one other question here for you regarding the foreign insurgents or foreign agents on U.S. soil. You know, earlier this week on the morning briefing, we've talked about Sarah Adams and her appearances on the Sean Ryan show. She said there's something like 1,000 Al-Qaeda linked sleeper cells here in the United States. At least as of right now, it does not appear like the New Orleans terrorist is affiliated with Al-Qaeda, but he was flying an ISIS flag. Have you heard anything else on that, or do you have any other thoughts here?
I haven't, but I did listen to part of the Sarah Adams and the Sean Ryan stuff, and I'm not surprised that there would be these foreign insurgents, Al Qaeda members or other Islamist groups inside the United States, because they're all over Latin America too. Hezbollah has a huge presence in Latin America, and I did see I think some former Mexican officials said that like Trump declaring the cartels a terrorist organization would be a bad outcome because they're not terrorists. But as far as I understand, there's a huge intersection between criminal groups and Islamist groups with the cartels too. They have a lot of cooperation because they effectively, these Islamist groups like Hezbollah, they engage in like the narcotics trade to fundraise for operations and also send money back to Iran and Lebanon. So I wouldn't be surprised to see that here in the United States, but I don't have any particular insight into where they might be at. You're muted.
Jared, can you bring Max on, please? Max, I want to get your take on this. I don't know whether you've seen the podcast appearances. Sarah Adams is a former agency analyst and targeter, and she, I think it's the Al-Askari group, they've effectively determined they think that there's something like 1,000 Al-Qaeda linked sleeper cells or sleeper operatives here in the United States, essentially just waiting for the green light here. In terms of the next 4 years under the Trump administration, do you see any trigger events that could potentially make them go active? Oh, hey Max, we're having problems with the mute button today.
It's the technology, I don't see any significant triggers on that would wake up 1,000 Al-Qaeda sleeper cells. I don't know Sarah, so I really can't comment on the credibility of the information she's passing. But it does seem a little bit grandiose, 1,000 Al-Qaeda sleeper cells in the United States. I mean, are there 1,000 disgruntled Muslim immigrants in the United States that could do something because they're disgruntled and unhappy with the West and view us as infidels? Absolutely. The border's been open for how many years now? There are probably 100,000 that could easily be radicalized or already radicalized in the U.S. that would be willing to take up arms against the United States or its people. And it is possible that those disgruntled individuals, those radicalized individuals, could be used as a proxy by the left or by the administrative state to attack Americans in order to change U.S. policy, to basically restrict civil liberties even more and to give more power to the federal security agencies. That's a distinct possibility. But I don't really see anything other than the unhappiness with the deportation plan or some type of blowback from policies that might enable Israel to do something in the future against the Palestinian and the Hamas communities that people here wouldn't like. I mean, you could see something like that, but I just don't see any type of huge Al-Qaeda presence here. And I don't really see anything on the horizon that would trigger that type of action in the U.S.
Mm-hmm. I have no reason to doubt. I have no reason to disbelieve what she says, but that was kind of my initial reaction too. 1,000 is a nice round number, so I'm somewhat, at least initially, skeptical. I will say that.
Yeah, I mean, it could be. I don't know. I mean, anything's possible. I mean, look at 2024 and just the first few days of 2025. You got to step back and go, that we may be living in the wrong construct. We may not have jumped into the next one yet. So who knows what's really out there? We're going to find out this year, though. I can guarantee you that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And let me just say this, too, I mean, there's no telling who's over here, and could 1,000 Al-Qaeda operatives have come up through the southern border? Of course they could have. Could they be living here as illegal aliens? Of course they could be. Could they be embedding themselves, conducting pre-operational surveillance, identifying targets, just waiting for the green light? Of course they could be. But, I would also be interested in seeing the sources and the reasoning for that.
Yeah.
As always, guys, go ahead.
Mike, that would be a very sophisticated operation. And, some people say 9/11 was a very sophisticated operation. I'd say it was not as sophisticated as most people think. It was kind of a simpleton operation that was enabled by simpleton security services here in the U.S., which allowed these people to do what they did on 9/11. 1,000 Al-Qaeda sleeper cells getting woken up to do concerted actions against the United States and American citizens here. That would be a very, very sophisticated operation. And, I'm not certain that there is the headquarters element, the command element necessary to pull that off.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me play devil's advocate here. What if there's, what if this is not a concerted, centralized effort, and it's kind of autonomous and decentralized, with the directive being, see your way into the United States, kind of you're on your own. Of course, funding and coordinating is going to be an issue. And then what do you do once you get here? I don't know, being illegal, and we're going to try to get on welfare or get linked up with a financier, maybe, or a local mosque that is going to provide that funding. So just playing devil's advocate, I think it could be done on a very low level coordination, not centrally controlled. What do you make of that?
No, I think there could be, a lot of decentralized activity, unorganized activity, which is really just a bunch of lone wolf type operations. I don't see that as a significant threat to the United States. I see that more as like a significant criminal threat to communities. But you're right. I mean, look at our security services, namely the FBI and DHS. It's clown shows all around. Do we have any idea who's really here in the United States? Absolutely not. Do we have any idea whether there are 1,000 Al-Qaeda sleeper cells? Absolutely not. Why? Because neither the FBI or the Department of Homeland Security has spent any time at all looking to see if these people exist or if these groups are out there. They're focused on, white working class males, because supposedly, that's the greatest domestic terror threat that America faces. Oh yeah, veterans too. GWAT veterans who served their country admirably, ate the crap sandwich and then came back home, and they're a significant threat to America. But all these Muslims crossing the southern border, are not. That seems kind of silly, but that's what our security services have done. So Sarah could be right, but would we really know in the United States? Not from our security services.
Mm-hmm. I want to bring Mark on. I think Mark has a take here, but I would also just say this. We can look at Al-Qaeda going back to the mid 2000s, and they pretty much stopped trying to do foreign coordinated terrorist activities because NSA was too good. You've got to communicate electronically. That's going to be intercepted with the magnifying glass, the Eye of Sauron on you. And so instead they said, well, let's launch this magazine and let's instead try to radicalize people who are already in the West and turn them into terrorists rather than train them at these foreign training camps and then try to send them on aircraft with passports into the United States. So, Mark, given kind of what we know about Al Qaeda, and of course, there's also been some turnover in that organization. What do you make of Sarah Adams' claims? And do you think this is a realistic threat?
Yeah, I can't judge whether Sarah Adams is right or wrong, or how the figure works, but I do think it's significant to remember that the growth of the Islamic State as a transnational organization and ethos, really, to me, that's pretty significant. Al Qaeda, like you mentioned in the past, was highly sophisticated, well funded. You tend to get jihadists that had a very technical background, were well traveled much of the time, and then they would be able to embed themselves in places like Afghanistan and operate accordingly. I agree with you. I think that battle plan really changed, strategy changed. But the growth of the Islamic State as an insurgency, a global insurgency, is significant. You can go to places like where it's spread out from Syria and Iraq, highly sophisticated for the areas that they're operating. They rival the governments in many of these places. They often have technologies and technical skills that even the local military that's attempting to try to uproot them, that they don't have. This is common in West Africa, Central Africa, up in Libya. So where that fits in the United States that I think is significant is that this, with the growth of the internet and social media and the ability to connect ideologies together across borders, this is where I think the real vulnerability lies. And I do think Max brought up a really good comment about this, is that our security services are very much motivated now by political priorities that kind of come down from who's in the White House. There's also the litigious side of things. There's a whole apparatus built to preventing things like profiling and suing government agencies, suing police departments for violating people's civil rights. There's not really much of an apparatus built up to protect the everyday American citizen that gets profiled on the obverse side of that. Like Max mentioned, GWAP veterans, for example. There's really not much institutional muscle for that. This all, at the end of the day, whether it's right or wrong, it benefits this strategy that Islamic State and Al Qaeda will use in the United States to be able to radicalize people that are here. They don't necessarily need to pull off a 9/11. If they can get enough of these radicalized people, maybe like a veteran, like the attacker in New Orleans, for example, if they can just feed them enough breadcrumbs that allows them to kind of take one of these terrorist acts in their own hands, I mean, they've made a victory. They don't necessarily have to do much more than that to destabilize our culture, to get people to be really afraid, to change the way. Really, what is terrorism? It's changing the way that we operate. And if you look at the United States since 9/11, we've become significantly less free. This has impacted our own lexicon. I hear everyday people using terms that were really generated during the global war on terror to address terrorists. And now you have Americans calling each other terrorists, traitors, all these, terms that we tend to use in a security sense. I mean, in a lot of ways, they can achieve victory without having to be too sophisticated.
Yeah, stochastic terrorists, people who say things we don't like. Hey, I want to bring Max on, and I want to ask you both this question, but I want to start with Max because, Max, you're a pilot. We've seen drones change the face or kind of change warfare in Ukraine. How long is it going to be with commercially available drone components, DIY drone kits? You can weaponize any drone you want effectively in the United States with commercial off-the-shelf technology here. How long is it going to be before there are, say, Islamic terrorist attacks here involving drones?
Mike, I think there's a series of steps that we're going to see before, we get to America looking like the battlefield in Ukraine with FPV drones flying around, blowing people up. First off, I think number one is we haven't seen any sophisticated Islamic State or Al Qaeda type operations other than, I guess the guy in New Orleans, cooked his own explosives or something. And I don't think we know exactly what was in those IEDs yet, but they were supposedly viable. first off, you have to have the people that are willing to do these operations. And then second, you have to have access to explosives. And I'm not talking about incendiaries that, in non-explosive materials that can be made into pipe bombs and things like that. I'm talking about actual high-order explosives like C4, Semtex, commercial explosives, things like that. You have to see the proliferation of that type of explosive into the hands of unauthorized people before you're going to see that kind of stuff mounted on a drone and then sent in, FPV to, kill a target. So we're still, I think, a long way out from that. Is it theoretically possible if you had somebody willing to do that type of terrorist act and you had access to explosives, maybe you could cook your own TTP without blowing yourself up? Maybe, and build their own drone and then do that. Yes, it's theoretically possible, but right now it's not probable, not within the next couple of years. Now, will we eventually get to that point? Yes, we will. All warfare evolves, and we will eventually evolve into that being a credible threat here in the United States, but I don't see it in anytime soon in the next few years.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Max. Mark, do you have anything to add? Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I like Max's timeline there. I think that's pretty spot on. But I agree. I think this is going to change the face of warfare in general. But I also think it's going to have a major impact on terrorist acts and insurgencies. One of these things that I think is significant to me is that we have a very lawless region across our southern border. This is an area where something like a drone attack could be pulled off pretty easily. And the big thing here is that the level of sophistication required is diminishing in terms of the operator. And then also the costs associated with drones continually is getting cheaper, and as they get better and more effective. This is going to have a huge impact, I think, in how we conduct war, how we, our security posture, our national security priorities. And then where it puts the United States, I think, is in terms of like the risk from terrorists, insurgents, and then also foreign powers. It puts the United States in a bind. Are we going to encourage our domestic drone capabilities to keep up with the rest of the world? If we do that, that means we have to impose very significant restrictions, as they're already trying to navigate right now. That's going to have a give and take relationship with people's civil liberties here in the United States and our ability to work with these technologies in real time. So I think this is going to be a very difficult problem for the United States to solve, and I don't doubt that terrorists are going to exploit that.
One thing I was just thinking of, like I remember in Afghanistan, ID components coming up through the south. I think it was Bahram Shah there in the South Afghanistan, like South Helmand, South Kandahar province. And with our own southern border being as leaky as it has been, and we can even look at cartels flying drugs using drones, to play devil's advocate here, what's to stop HME being produced, say, in Mexico and flown over the border with a drone. And now a terrorist wouldn't have the problem of having to create some high order detonation when he can get those components from south of the border via drone. Max, do you think that's realistic?
It's theoretically possible. I'll say this: the reason it hasn't happened so far is because nobody wants that smoke. The cartels don't want it. The smuggling operations don't want it. Nobody wants to see explosives crossing the border, being smuggled across and being used to blow up American citizens, because then the boot is going to come down hard. And I'm not talking civil liberties. I'm talking like hard covert operations on the border to ferret out who is doing this, and there's going to be a lot of punishment. And cartels survive because they make money. They make money running people. They make money running drugs, and they will not be able to survive in an environment where we are doing actual Title 50 lethal covert operations on the border. They can't survive in that. They will become a co-belligerent in that fight, and and that's going to reduce the amount of money that they're bringing in. So from just a business perspective, they have a motivation to prevent the kind of HME smuggling across the border. Because really, seriously, that is the key tipping point here in America, is if we start seeing the proliferation of HME, high explosive material, in our communities, that is going to be a game changer. And right now, everyone wants the status quo because everybody's making money.
Mm-hmm. Max, that's a great point. And also, in all fairness to Sarah Adams, I have not read the Al Qaeda 2.0 book. However, I will. I'll order it today and get on that also. And maybe I'll finish listening to all the Sean Ryan episodes as well, and maybe we'll have a different perspective on that. All right, guys, I think we have time maybe for one other question. Here we go from Bad Wabbit. Is there any truth to China having a few battalions in Mexico? I guess you're talking about PLA, Chinese troops in Mexico. We've talked about the Islamic threat, but what about coordinated Chinese threat attack? Max, Mark, Robert, Jared, we've heard that the Chinese are protecting illegal mining. They're working in Mexico. They're working with the cartels, so on and so forth. We know that's true. We'll start with Max and we'll cycle through. Any thoughts on this, Max?
I don't see any danger from the China's People's Armed Police, which are mostly what they deploy to protect, business assets overseas, or contractors, or even if they have actual Chinese military battalions that are doing some type of training operation in Mexico. I don't think that's where the threat would come from vis-a-vis China. I think if we escalated tensions with China to the point where we're doing kind of, tit for tat proxy or small unit operations, it would be much more likely that the Chinese would use an irregular warfare profile, basically pay, arm, equip, train cadres of indigenous Mexicans or people from Central or South America that are residing in Mexico, and then send them across the border to do that, so they have some type of plausible deniability. I think that would be the real threat, and that would be something that intelligence-wise we would want to be looking at any Chinese presence in Mexico or Central America, specifically to mitigate that.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I don't think Mexico wants the diplomatic problems that brings, either having to deal with the United States. We'll end with this question, roundtable question. We'll go Max, Jared, Robert, Mark. What do you consider our biggest threat inside the homeland? Again, starting with you, Max, and we'll move on.
I see the biggest threat inside the homeland really right now is going to be gone in about 17 days. That's the biggest threat in the homeland right now. Hopefully it'll be gone in 17 days. I think it's the radicalization of everyday normal working class Americans by a government that is authoritarian and overreaching and crushing civil liberties. That's the threat we have to watch. It's not the Americans, it's the individuals that are doing the radicalizing. We have to stop the radicalizing, and we have to stop the division between the government and the people of the United States, because the government works for us. This is a country by and for the people. So we need to get back to the government becoming an enabler for success in America, instead of a predatory entity that you have to constantly, look over your shoulder to make sure you're not being entrapped in some scheme or put on a watch list or being identified or targeted for some 6 a.m. raid because somebody got confused on the paperwork when you bought a gun 5 or 10 years ago. That stuff is ridiculous, and that's very radicalizing, and that's I see that as the greatest threat that we have to get over.
Mm-hmm. All right, Max, thanks for that. We'll move on to Robert.
On the flip side of talking about security threats, I think the biggest, to me, threat inside of the United States is the increase in these, foreign organized crime. You're talking like Tren de Aragua, some of these other gangs coming up from Latin America because of this disruptive border we've had for 4 years now. I think we'll start to see a loss of legitimacy of local and state governments because there's going to be, they're going to have a hard time enforcing against these. I think against these gangs. I think in Colorado, the big problem with Tren de Aragua taking over the apartment building that came out was that the local police didn't want to respond to calls at that in these locations because they can't. They don't, they're in mortal danger, and they don't have the capacity to fight an organized group like that. And I think that's one of the biggest threats here is we start seeing something like what people call anarcho-tyranny. Basically, the law enforcement enforces the law against people that it feels like it has the capacity to do so, and doesn't against those they don't. And those they don't are a lot of these foreign gangs that are increasingly committing violent crime, major thefts, like resource thefts in the Texas oil fields, literally pulling power lines down to get the copper out of them in an organized manner. And I think this is going to continue growing. We've just seen the beginning of it after multiple years of cross-border disruption.
Mm-hmm. Fair points. Thanks, Robert. We'll move on to Jared.
All right. Kind of building off exactly what Robert and Max have said, that legitimization of the state, I think, is the biggest threat, because I can't tell you how many times I have family members come and go, okay, so what's the real story? What do we really know? And that tells me that they don't trust at all what's coming out of, the authorities that are supposed to actually run the whole show. And that results in the radicalization that Max was talking about. People just go, okay, well, if they're not going to handle it, I need to become the government. And that's how you get radicals.
Yeah, vigilantism. Yeah. All right. Thanks for that, Jared. Mark?
Yeah, the biggest threat in the homeland to me is the dysfunction that comes with the political dysfunction that we have, the institutional discussion and deterioration that we've seen, and then finally foreign influence in the United States. I think that it's one of those underlying issues that continually affects our politics. We talked a little earlier about the Mexican lobby, for example. Americans don't even know how much their political representatives, how much they are directed by foreign influence. There's all of these forces that are kind of pulling these political mechanisms that are meant to resolve problems that cannot be solved any other way. And we don't have that option in the United States. It's increasingly shrinking and adding to more dysfunction and frustration among the population because we really don't have a way to expel some of these nefarious forces that are directing our political mechanisms to other means and not the national interest. I think if this continues to go on, there's a lot tied up into this: economics, finance, security. But if this is allowed to continue to go on, there really isn't an option for the American people to continue life the way that they've known it. It's going to radically change how we do things. I think it's going to make us less safe, less prosperous. It's going to be a major problem. So my eyes are really on President-elect Trump as he comes in. I hope we can see some of these things get changed.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thanks, Mark. I would say for me, it's probably a little more long-term. And that is, I think we're actually headed towards a giant financial crisis. I don't know when, probably within the end of this decade. If I had to guess, probably before the end of the Trump administration. And so, it's easy to have relative political stability, relative social stability when you have relative economic stability. But for me, the economy really is the linchpin. The future of the dollar, the economy, the fiscal situation, the debt situation with the federal government, the financial situation in the markets has been relatively stable. And I'm somewhat concerned in the next 4 years that we will not have that stability, which is going to cause much greater political and social instability. And so for me, this is the linchpin that has to be protected, our own financial and economic stability. I'm not sure that it will be, and I am. So I would say, that's probably the biggest threat that I see, in addition to what everyone else said. All right, well, everyone, thanks so much for watching. That's going to do it for this week's Early Warning Roundtable. As a reminder, we do this every Friday starting at 10 a.m. Central Time. Each early warning analyst gets a turn to talk about their biggest thing for that week, and then we open it up to Q&A. If you would like to join us, we also do the morning briefing. We have a whole intelligence platform that's available at www.earlywarningnetwork.com. Try us out. And actually, I think you can go to earlywarningnetwork.com/trial and get a free 7-day trial and try us out free for 7 days. Again, we appreciate your support. Thanks for watching. We'll be back in your inbox on Monday morning. Back in the early morning, the morning briefing starting at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.